Thank you very much. I hope that you hear me well. Please let me know if there's any communication problems.
We hear
I
you
will,
well.
yeah, good. I will not need any slides, so it'll just be me talking with you. And the talk that I'm going to give is based on my latest book, actually just published in the United States and Europe, called The Entanglement: How Art and Philosophy Make Us What We Are. While it is not directly on the topic of empathy, I think in a way it is, I think of this work that I'm going to be describing with you today as, which I should say is very much work in progress, the talk I'm going to give, as working towards something like a groundwork for how one might think about empathy. Mother has always viewed her son's choice of life partner as somehow beneath him. She has persisted in looking upon the younger woman with a critical and unloving eye. At some point, provoked by whatever eventualities, mother has occasion to rethink her harsh picture of her daughter-in-law. Mother-in-law now comes to be able to see her as the lively and supportive source of happiness in her son's life that she is. This vignette, as I'm sure most of you recognize, is from Iris Murdoch, and its main significance for her is ethical. The active moral agent, she believed, is one who directs an open heart and a loving gaze toward others. To fail to do so, for her, is to fall short in one's dealing with others. It is in some ways to fail them. According to Murdoch, goodness is tied up with, quote, a refined and honest perception of what is really the case, a patient and just discernment and exploration of what confronts one, which is the result not simply of opening one's eyes, but of a certain perfectly familiar kind of moral discipline, closed quote. She also characterizes attention as, and she cites Simone Weil, the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. Attention is a just and loving gaze directed upon an individual reality. Now, what I wanted to talk about with you today is really not the question of the moral agent and whether the kind of perceptual capacity that Murdoch describes is the proper mark of the active moral agent, as Murdoch puts it. My topic rather is the way of thinking about perception that Murdoch's vignette suggests. Is ordinary perceiving ethically loaded in this sort of way? Is it vision that she has in mind when she invites us to consider a refined and honest perception of what is really the case? Might it really be that seeing itself, or our ability perceptually to know people and other things, is a kind of discipline, let alone a moral discipline, such that we can think of perceiving as something we learn over the course of a lifetime to do or to accomplish, and that's something that human beings and indeed other animals might somehow fail to learn, or a capacity that we might fail to cultivate? And finally, is it true that you need a loving and open heart to see? Now, if you think of perception as fixed by light and distance and, the nervous system, if you think of it as a determinate relation between a perceiver and an object, be it a person or anything else, then it might be pretty obvious that Murdoch isn't talking about perception here. Vision, for example, in contrast with what she's talking about, does seem to be something you get just by opening your eyes in a light-filled environment. Consider further that for Murdoch, the sort of event that might cause mother-in-law to fashion anew her experience of her daughter-in-law could very well be, and this may in fact be what she has in mind, the young woman's absence, or even her death. That is, it's her death, it's her disappearance that lets, on Murdoch's way of thinking, that lets me first see her as she really is. But if this is right, then it seems that Murdoch isn't talking about perception in the ordinary way, where in the ordinary way, you can't see something which isn't there. Perception is a kind of physical contact with the thing. Now, I'm actually not very persuaded by that kind of consideration. And one reason is that, as those of you who know my work on perception know, I'm increasingly, in all of my writing, I've been struck by the ways, and this is very present in the phenomenological tradition, the ways in which perception always gives us access to that which is absent. Presence in and presence as absent are not, from my point of view, and I think this is the sort of thing that Husserl or Merleau-Ponty might agree with, that's not perception in an extended or metaphorical sense. Those are the core cases. I've also become skeptical that we can draw sharp lines between what we see as opposed to what we merely think is there or what we merely imagine is there. So for those kinds of reasons, it's not obvious to me that Murdoch's way of thinking about perception might not be a good proposal. And taking courage from her proposal, the idea that I want to share with you now is this. There is, in fact, no such thing as indifferent perception. That is, indifference is, if you like, the root of all blindness. And perceiving, really correctly understood, maybe should be thought of as a way of being not indifferent, as a way of being interested, as a way of being concerned. So I want to take seriously the thought that we might need very radically to rethink our taxonomy of mind such that love and caring might turn out themselves to be interestingly epistemic emotional states or emotional orientations, and that perception, for its part, is the exercise of precisely that kind of care and value. Now, do you need to love someone in order to see them? Or do you need to love something in order to see it? Put that baldly, it would seem to be too strong a claim. Surely we can see things or people even that we hate or dislike or find distasteful. But here, right away, a warning is in order for such negative attitudes of finding something distasteful or hateful or repugnant. Such negative attitudes are not love's opposite. Love's opposite is indifference. Hate, dislike, and the rest, while negative, share with love a certain interest in and, in a sense, orientation toward and curiosity about their objects. Now, what exactly the connection is between hate and love, I don't really want to theorize that too much here with you now today. But as a working characterization, I would suggest that they share a common relation of concern for orientation to their objects. So on that way of thinking about it, love and hate might be species of a common genus. They differ in terms of the positive or negative valence of the attitude, but the orientation, the concern, the directedness toward the object are similar. And I think this isn't far-fetched when you think of how fascinated we are with our enemies, how much we love to read about our, the political figures that we most despise, and so on and so forth. So the thesis that I want to entertain with you today is not that you need to love X to see it, or that we see X by caring about it, or by somehow loving it, or that love is a mechanism of seeing, rather that seeing itself, and I'm using seeing just as a standard for perception more generally, that seeing itself is a way of exercising one's interest in, curiosity about, one's orientation towards, one's care for the objects. So perception is not love, but perception is, in a very interesting way, a kind of love-like orientation to the objects of perception. Now, there's something clearly almost paradoxical about the thought that in order to see a person, thereby to come to know them, you must already care about them. For in order to care about them, it would seem then you must already know them. And we find ourselves in the midst of a vaguely Platonic puzzle with the vaguely bizarre upshot that either we can know no one or we've always already known everyone and everything, or at least every perceptible thing. But the would-be paradox is easily dismantled by giving up the assumption, admittedly a reasonable assumption, that seeing a person is one thing and valuing them or caring about them or being interested in them another. Seeing and valuing are works in process and processual, and they are interdependent. Thus, to care about something or someone is precisely to be dedicated, not necessarily through an act of conscious decision, to the never entirely unfinished work of coming to know them. And to know a person, or to perceive a person, that is to come to know them, is to be dedicated to the work of bringing them into view and holding them there. That is to say, it is to orient oneself to a person or thing in just the sort of way that caring about them amounts to. Now, it might be objected, it can't be true that to love someone or to care about them is to come to know them. Sometimes you just already do. For example, you can't come to know your child, for you already do. So if you also love your child, this loving can consist in your dedication to the task of coming to know them. Oh, would that it were so, as if you really finally, once and for all, know anybody, even your own children. This is why I emphasize the always unfinished processual character of knowing someone. It's hard to know a person. There's always more to learn or to discover. And it's hard to sustain the knowledge, the intimacy that you have. Now, part of this has to do with the fact that we're always changing all the time, but that's a sort of trivial point. The point I'm trying to make here, which is deeper and more fundamental, is that what you know, the other, always exceeds what you can hold or fix or achieve finally. So to be in relationship with another is to care about making and sustaining that contact. So just as the dancer, to give an analogy, enacts their relationship with their dance partner in the motivated adjustments of the dancing itself, so the friend or lover, or I want to say perceiver, enacts the relationship in which the friendship or the perceiving consists, in which love consists, in a kind of striving to do so. And this very relationship is the achievement of the other. It is the coming to know them. Now, still, I can't quite let it go. You might want to object. How do you break into the circle of knowing and loving? You need to know to care and care to know, but then how does it ever get started? And again, I think I've already given us the beginnings of the resources for thinking how we might do that. Loving, or at least caring, and knowing are different aspects of one and the same process of orienting ourselves and dedicating ourselves, which is just to say, settling into and attuning ourselves to the play and work of being with another, of orienting ourselves to the other, or to the idea, or to the thing, to the object of love. And so love and knowing arrive at the party together. So this is my theme. As with love and other love-like relationships of care, so with perception. To perceive is not merely to register, to detect, or to represent. It is to come to know, to make the situation's acquaintance, to accomplish intimacy. And here's the basic claim: perceiving, like loving, is never merely a relation. It's always rather a relationship. So a somewhat simplistic comparison may help, I adjust the microscope to secure the focus of the item I'm interested on the slide. But those adjustments of the eyepiece are not antecedent to the seeing of the item. They're not, as it were, analogous to wiping the window clean so that I can then see through it. They are rather the way I see. They are the adjustments of the microscope, the ways, the negotiations whereby I bring the object into focus, whereby I achieve its presence. So I actualize my perception of the microbe in these negotiations and adjustments, these exercises of motivated skill and curiosity. And the work of then getting and keeping the microbe, keeping it in focus, is the relationship of seeing. And it is also, I think, at this point, rather obviously, something like the work of caring. And so, like human relationships more generally, perception is organized by care, concern, and value, not always positive. Now, it has been observed that you don't love someone because of their qualities. If you did, then your love would be fickle and inconstant, since qualities change, and since lots of people share the same qualities. Rather, you appreciate the qualities of your beloved because you love them. It's the love that first puts you in a position to know them, or better, the love, the emotion itself, is precisely the relationship of coming to know them, being with them, accepting them. Now, not all relationships are loving, but all relationships, as I've been suggesting, are dynamic, plural activities of sustaining an orientation to an object or person, and thus, in that sense, an openness to them. Interestingly and tellingly, as I've already said, this be true no less of hate. Now, one important thing about relationships is that they are, as I've already suggested, self-actualizing, and so in a way self-concerning or self-referring. Love enables you to know the object that is the target and just the justification of your love. And I think the same is true of any human relationship. We enact our relationships. This is an enactive view. We don't, as it were, just stand in them. This is sometimes obscured because some of our relationships are, in the language of Nico Kolodny, attitude independent. Two people can stand in the spouse relationship to each other, or that of parent to offspring, or that of being co-workers, regardless of their attitude to each other. So these are, in the usage that I'm recommending, mere relations. True relationships, as I'm using the word, in contrast, of their very nature are attitude dependent. A relationship is an orientation to another that makes it possible for the other to be truly present. So the relationship I have with my colleague is that in virtue of which they can show up for me the way they do, for example, as someone to whom I can turn, or on whom I can rely, or who I can trust in our work together. This relationship is not something that just comes for free in virtue of our standing in a mere relation. That is, this relationship is not something that just comes for free. It's something we make and accomplish. So I've said that relations are kind of self-actualizing. They're attitude dependent. They're also fragile. And by this I mean, not merely that relationships can break down or fail or come to an end. I have in mind rather the fact that the vulnerability of relationships to change, their liability to fail, their susceptibility to change, and thus their demand for attention and sustenance is one of their basic features. To be in a relationship with a person, an idea, a movement, a cause, an object, to be in a relationship is always necessarily to be concerned, explicitly or implicitly, with the status of that relationship. The second order anxieties are, if you will, alive and entangled with the first order engagements that make up your relationship. So compare with a perceptual case, like color. It belongs to the very nature of a color that how it looks tends to change as conditions change, as lighting changes, as my spatial relation to it changes, as the background colors of other objects changes. So to know the color, to perceive the color, is to know something whose presence is marked by and finds expression as a fluctuation, a disposition to vary. The ability to see is the ability to cope with and be sensitive to the vulnerability of the seeing itself. Or consider other projects, such as tripping. The tripping doesn't interrupt my hiking, but is rather, tripping isn't the project, hiking is the project. Tripping doesn't interrupt my hiking, but is rather a modality of my hiking or a moment in my hike. Or think about communication. Misunderstanding between us doesn't shut down communication between us. It only opens up new avenues for meaning making. And so in general, new opportunities for discussion. And in general, what I want to suggest is that a relationship is something that sustains itself in the face of its own vulnerability. So love, for example, is a relation to its object, but the relationship is always one of aspiration and becoming, one that includes within itself an attitude to itself, specifically one of dedication, commitment, and maybe sometimes anyway, anxiety. And as with love, so with perception. To perceive is not just to have something in view, it's to take on the task of doing the work of bringing the thing into view, and if you like, holding it there. Perception, like love, is a first order activity that is infused with the second order problem of maintaining its own fragility and uncertainty. So let me just say a little bit more to illustrate this, and then I'll stop and we'll have time for discussion. You hold a brick. You hold a porcelain pot. It's tempting to say that this is a generic exercise of feeling by touch, holding, yielding knowledge of the different natures of the objects in question. But I want to urge that this actually gets things backwards. The way we hold a delicate porcelain and the way we hold a brick are different. And it is precisely in these different ways we engage our holding that we enact these. Porcelain holding and brick holding are not just different applications of a generic holding relation. They're different ways of being in relationship with different things. And this reminds us that consciousness in general shouldn't be thought of as like a beam that lands indifferently on this or that, on jewels or garbage, clouds or friends. Seeing, for example, isn't an all-purpose, one-size-fits-all capacity. Plato, famously about vision, entertained the thought that when we see, we shoot forth a fire from the eyes that reaches all the way to the things. Aristotle mocked the idea of visual fire, and that's been the general attitude ever since. Despite this, and rather surprisingly, I think, the idea that seeing is one thing something like a visual fire streaming forth from the eyes, is assumed by most extant theories of vision. I sometimes think of this as sort of the Spider-Man theory of vision. You just shoot forth your consciousness and you see whatever it lands on, just as Spider-Man shoots forth his ray. The very idea that seeing is one thing, generic and always the same, I think, betrays a kind of neglect. And this is a neglect that really most theorists of vision, certainly in psychology and neuroscience and in cognitive science, I think fall prey to. The idea that I'm doing the same thing when I see a black and wet plastic bag stuck against the bottom of a wire fence, on an urban street, and when I watch my daughter perform a dance in her recital, is about as plausible as the idea that I'm doing the same thing when I throw a pot and throw a baseball. Yes, we use the hands when we throw a pot and throw a ball, and these are both kinds of throwing, but they correspond to different universes of my life. In general, the scientific study of perception has been resistant to this kind of complication, to this kind of consideration. And this comes out, for example, in the common assumption in scientific circles that vision is a strictly optical phenomenon, and that what is visible is that which projects to the eyes. But of course, we aren't confined when we see just to what projects to the eyes. We see the hidden parts of the things that we see, or at least we experience their presence. We experience the natures and identities of the things we see. And we come to know people, for example, in the exercise of our perceptual capacity. So as you can tell from the sort of trajectory of my remarks, this is really part of a bigger, longer paper in which I now try to show, I would go on in the latter portion of the paper to show how the idea that perceiving is a way of caring helps us make progress that we haven't been able to make in thinking about how perception works. Most theorists who've thought about perception tend to ask the question, how do we manage to see so much given the limited information that is projected and recorded on our retinas? And the answer is, well, the brain somehow goes beyond what is delivered to the nervous system and constructs or confabulates a larger world. But for me, the more interesting question has always been, why do we see so little? Why do we see so little of what there is around us to see? Why is seeing so hard? And in a way, the intuition I'm working with in this new paper, which, as I say, grows out of this new book, The Entanglement, which I've just published, the intuition I'm working with is that in a way, perceiving is so hard because caring is so hard. Love is hard. Sometimes we think of love as, oh, anybody can love. Love is just this easy thing. It's just a feeling. It's part of our nature as human beings to be capable of love. But I'm very impressed by how hard it is to love another, how hard it is to know another, how hard it is to care, how hard it is to follow through on everything required to maintain and sustain our relationships with each other. And it seems to me that there's really a very tight, interesting isomorphism between those kinds of problems, the problems of caring and the problems of perceiving. And I'll mention one final comment in the last minute that I have. In a way, my motto in this is Merleau-Ponty, who, as you know, emphasized the indeterminacy of perception. Somewhere towards the first 100 pages of the Phenomenology of perception, Merleau-Ponty says, there's nothing harder than knowing exactly what we see. And one of the suggestions that I want to make is that the way to think about the hardness of understanding what we see is connected to the idea of the hardness, the difficulty, the challenges of understanding what we care about. That the limits of perception in some sense are mapped out by the limits of concern or by the limits of love. So to go back to Murdoch, with whom I began, I guess I want to endorse this idea that perceiving is a kind of practice whereby we can learn better to know each other and achieve each other. And I hope that this final comment shows the strong connections that I see between the theme I'm discussing and empathy. And by my watch, it has now been 1/2 an hour. So